Well, good morning. Again. If I haven't met you before, I didn't tell you this before, but my name is Brian. I'm on staff here at Lake Springs. And this morning, I would like to share with you one of, if not the most embarrassing moments of my life. What better day to relive it than today? So I want to take you back to 2003. So 2003, I had just started dating this girl who has now become my wife, despite what I'm about to tell you. We had just started dating. Now, back then, a little bit still today, but back then, I was the most shy person you will ever meet in your entire life. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't know how to talk to anyone, my friends, let alone talk to a girl. And so we started dating, and it was only because someone told me that if I asked her out, she would say yes. And so I called her up and asked her out over the phone, and she said yes. And I was like, okay, bye. I don't know how to have a conversation with you. And so we started dating. We'd hang out at church and so forth, and we'd go to movies. That was kind of the thing that we would do out, was we'd go to movies with groups of friends and so forth. And we were going to movies for a while. We were hanging out, and we had been together for a little while, and I thought it was time to take our relationship to the next level. Now, as eighth graders in church, the next level was I was ready to hold her hand. Or so I thought. I was ready, but I was so nervous. I was like, man, what if I go to do it and I miss, or she doesn't want it, and then I'm this weirdo, and I just, day after day, week after week, I just could not get up the guts to do it. And so finally we were going to a movie. We were going to see Pirates of the Caribbean, the very first one, 2003. And we were going, and I was like, all right, today's the day. This is happening today. And so we were going with this group of friends, and we're sitting there, the movie's going, and I'm not paying attention to anything that's going on in the movie. The whole time, just like, okay, do it. Like, just do it. Like, I'd psyched myself out beforehand, and I was like, today's the day. And I just, as scene after scene went on, I was just like, don't do it. No, it's kind of a romantic scene. I'll look like a creep, and I don't want to do it now. And so I'm going to wait till this. And I just kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And then eventually I was just like, closed my eyes, gritted my teeth, and I was like, all right, it's time. And I just reached out, and I grabbed her hand. And she grabbed it back. And it was the greatest moment of my 8th grade life until, I kid you not, 2 seconds later. Credits roll, movie's over. And so now, I'm the weirdo who waited the entire movie to grab her hand, only to, not gonna lie, 2 seconds later, let go real quick. And I'm just frozen. Like, I can't believe I just did that. What's she gonna think? And of course, she was way too nice to talk to me about it afterwards or to address how weird it was. In fact, I don't think we ever talked about it until last night when I told her I was going to tell this story today. But despite all that, we stayed together, and it was great. But I remember going home and thinking, like, life is over. Like, I am sure that other friends we were with saw that, and they're all talking about it. And there is no coming back from this. This is as bad as it gets for my 8th grade life. And so today, we're going to share a story about someone who kind of hit a point in their life where it was as bad as it gets. And not in an 8th grade holding hands way, but in a real way, that what they had done and where they got to this point in their life, things that had gotten probably what I would think is so bad that it would have seemed like there's just no way to come back from this. And so today we're going to be continuing in the book of Mark that we've been in for some time. And if you're newer with us, we've been looking just at the last week of Jesus' life as we're leading up to Easter. And so we're looking at each of these stories coming towards the end of the book of Mark. We're going to be in Mark chapter 14 today. And we're going to be looking at the story of Peter. And we're going to be looking at Peter at a time in his life that I would imagine he thought, this is as bad as it gets for me. So if you got a Bible, you can go ahead and open up to Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 53. And where we are in the story, where we're coming off of his last week, is we saw Jesus with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. We see this plot to arrest Jesus finally coming to fruition. That's been in the works all the way since Mark chapter 3. That it finally happens. Judas's betrayal happens, and they arrest Jesus, and he's taken away. And that's where we're picking up in the story today in Mark 14, starting in verse 53. It says, "They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together, and Peter followed them at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire." So this is kind of just us setting the stage for the story. We see Jesus being led away, he's arrested, and we see Peter following, but at enough of a distance that he doesn't seem to be related to Jesus or associated with Jesus. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see Mark, the book of Mark, the author here, Mark, use this literary device that he uses throughout the book. And we may have mentioned it before, but oftentimes throughout the book, Mark uses this literary device called a sandwich. And so what he's doing is he kind of sets up a story, gives us the beginning to a story, and then as if we were watching a movie, he just kind of cuts it and smash cuts to a completely different story. And then we see this story unfold, and then towards the end, we see a smash cut back to the exact same story that we started with. And oftentimes the innards of the sandwich, the meat and the cheese and so forth, inform the bread, inform the outside of the sandwich. Do you follow me? You get what I'm saying? And so this is where we are today. We see Mark set up this part of the story that Peter is following Jesus at a distance, and then we smash cut over to Jesus with the high priest, with the chief priests, and we're left not really knowing what's going on with Peter. But we know he followed at a distance. Right now he's out with the guards, warming himself by the fire, and now we see what's going on with Jesus. And we continue in verse 55. "The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree." And so here we see an interesting detail that shows us how desperate they were to pin something on Jesus. They arrested Jesus, but to make their accusations stick. See, what we find out, or what they would have known, is all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy, we get some laws about how these proceedings should happen. And that if someone is accused of breaking a law, there has to be at least two witnesses, and their stories have to corroborate each other. The stories have to line up. And if they don't, then the person can't be accused. The person can't be punished. And we see it tells us that many testified falsely against him. And that same passage in Deuteronomy tells us that if someone testifies falsely against someone else, then the accuser will get the punishment of the accused. That makes sense? That if you levy false witness against someone, and it's found out, you will get the punishment that you were trying to give to the other person. And so what we see is how desperate they are to pin something on Jesus, that they're levying accusations against him, even though they most likely knew that this could land them getting the same punishment that they're trying to give to Jesus. And so that's where we are. They're giving these false accusations, false testimony against Jesus, and their statements don't even line up, even though they are false. Then we continue in 57. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. "We heard him say, I will destroy the temple. I will destroy this temple made with human hands, yet in 3 days we'll build another, not made with hands. And yet even their testimony did not agree." So this may sound a little familiar. Jesus, we talked about this a few weeks ago, talked about the temple being destroyed and rebuilt, but he never says, "I will destroy the temple." And so even though they're taking bits and pieces of things that Jesus said, they're still not getting it right, and their stories still aren't lining up, and their testimonies still aren't agreeing. And it almost here seems like, especially if we don't know the outcome of the story, Jesus might make it out of here. Like the testimonies aren't lining up. They have to have at least two witnesses. Their stories aren't backing each other up. It almost seems like Jesus is about to get off free. But then we see what happens in verse 60. "Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' 'I am,' said Jesus. 'And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.'" And so we see these accusations made against Jesus. Despite the fact that they're not true, he remains silent. And in doing that, he's fulfilling this prophecy that we see all the way back in Isaiah 53, that tells us that he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, And as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. So although they're levying these false accusations against him, and even though he knows what they're trying to do to him, he remains silent. And we see that he is almost in the clear until he is asked about himself. He is asked, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And he doesn't stay quiet anymore, but he answers, I am. And then he continues by quoting from Daniel and from Psalm 110 about who he is, about seeing the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, coming on the clouds of heaven. And just like that, if he is wrong, he committed blasphemy, which is punishable by death. So right like that, he gave them something to charge him with, and right then he signed his own death warrant. And so if we're hearing this for the first time, it can seem like, Jesus, why are you doing this? Why not just stay quiet? They got to let you go, or at least they got to prolong this a little bit. But instead of just staying silent, even though everyone around him is bearing false witness about him, he bears true witness about himself, is honest about who he is, and in doing so signs his own death warrant. Verse 63, the high priest then tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they condemned him as worthy of death. And some began to spit on him, and they blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. It says the high priest tore his clothes, which it even tells us all the way back in Leviticus chapter 10 that the high priest, even in times of grief, were forbidden from tearing their clothes. And so this was such a grievous act that Jesus did that the high priest tore his clothes. They abused him. They attacked him. They spit on him, which was the most severe form of disrespect that you could do to somebody. And then right in the midst of this abuse, right in the midst of them accusing him, attacking him, right then, we smash cut back to Peter. We go right back to the bottom bread of our sandwich, where we don't see a resolution of what happens with Jesus, but we go all the way back to see what Peter's doing in the meantime. And so picking up in verse 66, last time we saw Peter, he was standing outside. He had followed Jesus at a distance, and now he's standing outside in the courtyard, warming himself by the fire with the guards. And then verse 66, it says, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with the Nazarene Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. And again, he denied it. And after a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them. You are a Galilean. And he began to call down curses and swore to them, I don't know this man that you're talking about. And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and he wept. You see, I think that Mark has a very important reason for creating this sandwich that he's created for us. We see the scene set up with Peter in the courtyard, and then we immediately cut to people bearing false witness against Jesus. And Jesus, despite being in danger, despite his life being on the line, bearing true witness about himself. And then we cut to Peter, who then bears false witness about Jesus. Guilty of doing the same thing that those who are accusing Jesus are doing. Refusing to associate with him, being dishonest about it. And then we see that he remembers that Jesus told him this would happen, and he broke down and he wept. And I would imagine here that Peter's guilt was pretty overwhelming. That he always claimed to be one of the best, that he claimed to always be one that would stick by Jesus no matter what. And then right here, he denies him right at the time where he might need him the most. This is not just a one time, but this is a culmination, I think, of Peter's failure. We see that he was warned ahead of time to be on guard, but he wasn't. We saw last week that he was told in the Garden of Gethsemane to stay awake and pray, but he fell asleep. And here he was given 3 opportunities in the courtyard to identify with Jesus, and he didn't. And this right here appears to be the end of Peter's story. at least in the Gospel of Mark. We don't get anything else about Peter after this. In fact, the only mention of his name we even get after this story is when the women go and find to Jesus' tomb after he's died and find that he's not there. They're told to go tell the disciples and Peter. Almost as if the guilt made him feel as if he doesn't associate with them anymore. But we don't get any resolution to his story. We don't find out what happens. We don't get any redemption. That's it. That's it for Peter. And many of us might feel like we're in that exact same place right now. That we're in a place where there seems to be no coming back from. That there seems to, because of something I've done, or because of something about me, or the way I've treated someone else, or the way I've treated God, that there's no way to come back from what I've done. That God is a God of redemption, but I think I've used up one too many chances. And it's very possible you're sitting here, and you might not feel that way at all. You might not feel that way one bit. But it's also possible that you're sitting by someone that does. That's just coming to church because sometimes, honestly, this can be the easiest place to hide. You show up every Sunday, no one asks if there's anything wrong. It's when you stop showing up that people start to notice. And so you might be sitting by someone that's right in the midst of that right now. And you might be here thinking that, you know what? I'm all good with Jesus. This is an interesting story for those that have walked away from him, but you know what? I've never been asked about Jesus, and I said, I don't know him. I've never denied him. I think I'm good. So I'll just sit back and listen, but I think I'm all right. And if that's where you're sitting right now, I hope that that's true, and it could be. But I also want us to remember that denying Jesus, betraying Jesus, those are harsh words, but it doesn't just mean the times when someone asks us point blank, are you with Jesus? And we say no. Or do you know Jesus? And we say no. It also has to do with how we treat those that are made in the image of God. How we treat those that are made in the image of God. Because simply betraying Jesus isn't simply just denying him with our words, but it's also in the times that we treat others that are made in God's image as less than us, as less than myself. In fact, I think it's important for us to remember this verse that's in 1 John. In 1 John chapter 4, it tells us that whoever claims to love God, yet hates a brother, not love the brother or sister whom they have seen, cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. So you may never have been asked, hey, do you know God? Are you a follower of Jesus? And you said no because you're afraid of the persecution, the oppression, and so forth. But I think that we've all had times where we treated someone around us as if they were less than me. I know I have. And I think it's important for us to remember that how we treat others directly reflects our view of God. If I truly believe that everyone in this room is made in the image of God, then the way that I treat them is how I'm treating the image of God. The way I treat you is how I'm treating the image of God. And how we treat each other directly reflects our view of God. And so what I want us to do here is I just want us to pause right in the middle of this message. We don't get a resolution to Peter's story in the book of Mark, but we do get it in the book of John, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. But as readers of the book of Mark, we just see him left in this place of sorrow, left in this place of having abandoned and betrayed Jesus. And I want us just to pause and sit with that for a few minutes. Because if you're sitting here thinking, hey, this is a place I've been in, or this is a place I'm in right now, there is one step that I think is very important for us to take. And that's the step of just going before the Lord in confession and repentance. Because one thing that we know about God is that he always responds to repentance with forgiveness. And so we're just going to pause. Instead of speaking theoretically, we're just going to stop here for a few minutes. As David plays, we're just going to let the music play. Just by yourself, in your seat, silently, we're just going to go before the Lord. And I'll do the same from up here. And just tell him, God, these are the places, these are the times that I've let you down. And I encourage you as you do this to be specific. It's in your head. No one can hear you but him. to not just, God, I'm a sinner, forgive me, but these are the places that I have dropped the ball, that I've treated those around me as less than me. And God, I need your forgiveness. And so we're just going to take a few moments for us to go before the Lord and confess to him right now. The good news is that if you took this time to go before God and confess the times that we've fallen short, the times that we have betrayed or denied Jesus, then he has already met you with forgiveness, with redemption, and with a chance for restoration. See, if you're in this place right now that we find Peter in, the good news is that his story's not over. And neither is yours. And we don't get a resolution to his story in the book of Mark, but we do in John. And so we're going to turn over there. And we're going to read the resolution to his story and see how Jesus was able to still use him and how Jesus was able to restore him despite his failure. So if we flip over to John chapter 21, where we pick up in this story, this is after Jesus' death, after his resurrection. He has shown himself to his disciples before, but I would imagine they're sitting in a place right now of just confusion. As we've been talking about, Jesus came as this Messiah, but not as the Messiah that any of them were expecting. He didn't come in power, he didn't come in strength, but he came as a lowly servant. And then he died. And I would imagine that it's a time of confusion for the disciples, and especially for Peter, knowing that I have just denied Jesus as one of the closest to him. I've denied him, I've turned away from him, and I don't know what to do from here. And that's what we're going to pick up in chapter 21, verse 1. It says, afterward, Jesus appeared again to the disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and it happened in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. See, I think that Peter's in this place of, I don't know what to do from here. I've denied Jesus. He's died. I don't know where we stand as disciples. I don't know what comes next. But what I do know is I know what I did before following Jesus, and that was I was a fisherman. So I think right now I'm just going to fish. And the other disciples go with him. Then verse 4 says, early in the morning, Jesus stood at the shore, but the disciples didn't realize it was him. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. And he said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. And the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. And the other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. So we see that they're not catching anything. They're sitting there in this time of confusion. They see someone call from shore saying, hey, have you caught anything? And they say, no, not yet. And he says, well, cast on the other side. And they have so many fish they can't haul it in. And then they connect the dots that this is Jesus. And Peter's response is just to jump in the water and book it for Jesus. It says they weren't far, about 100 yards. That's a football field. I can't swim 100 yards. I don't know about you. That's far to me. But he doesn't care. It doesn't matter what's going on. What he knows is that Jesus is there, and I'm going to do whatever I can to get to him. And so he jumps in the water. He swims. He runs for Jesus because nothing else matters in that moment. And then they come up behind him. Verse 9, when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you've caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. And it was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come, have breakfast. And none of the disciples dared ask, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was risen from the dead. So they come on land, they come on shore, and they walk up, and Jesus has a fire of burning coals, it says. Some other translations you might reading say a charcoal fire. And if we've been reading the book of John, we see that this is the same way that John describes the fire that Peter is standing around as he denies Jesus. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that our brains have a funny way of associating smell with memory. And I think that when Peter came on shore, saw this fire that Jesus was standing around, I think it's very possible that he was just transported immediately back to the time that he stood around a fire just like this and denied Jesus 3 times. And now he's standing right before the Jesus that he denied, standing there in the flesh. It says that Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast, knowing that we are pretty useless when we're hungry, right? So before addressing anything with them, before talking about what comes next, he just does what Jesus does. He addresses their physical needs. He just says, hey, just come and eat. And we'll talk in a few minutes, but let's just come and have breakfast together. Verse 15, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, I think what he's doing here is when he says more than these, I think he's saying, do you love me more than these other disciples do? You've always said you would stay with me till the end. You've always claimed to be one of the closest to me, acted like one of the best disciples. Well, even still, do you still love me more than these? Do you still love me more than these men? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. And again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. The third time says Peter was hurt, or Peter was grieved. I think he knew exactly what Jesus was doing and asking him 3 times, do you love me? And addressing the 3 times that he denied even knowing who Jesus was. He says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you, which is true. He didn't need to ask him. He knew where his heart was. I'm sure he knew that he was repentant, knew that he felt bad. But what he's doing is he's giving Peter the opportunity to acknowledge Jesus in the same way that he denied him. He's giving him a chance at restoration, a chance to come back in the same way that he walked away from him. He says, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. The difference in these phrases are less important than the overall meaning. And the overall meaning is that I, Jesus, want you, Peter, to carry on my mission as the Good Shepherd. That I'm about to be gone, and I need you to care for the sheep. I need you to continue the mission that you had started before, despite your failure, despite your shortcomings, despite denying me, you're still in the game. And I still need you to continue what you were doing before. And Jesus takes it even a step further in the next part. In verse 20, he says, Peter turned, it says, verse 18, it says, very truly I tell you, When you were younger, you dressed yourself and where you wanted. When you were old, you'll stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death in which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." When he's saying you stretch out your hands, what he's referring to is Peter's future death, his future martyrdom, which we know from history and tradition that Peter was most likely crucified. And so he's saying this actually as really good news. He's saying, you think that you're out of the game, you think that you denied me, and so I can't use you anymore, but guess what? You're still going to die for me, just like you always said that you would. You're still in this. I'm still going to use you, just like I did before. And as we see in John 10:11, he says that I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Saying, I need you to carry on my mission as the good shepherd, and in doing so, you will lay down your life for the sheep. You will lay down your life for me. See, Jesus isn't condemning Peter by looking back to what he did. He's not getting up there and saying, you denied me 3 times. What do you got to say about that? He's not waiting for an apology. He's not looking back to what Peter did, but he's looking forward to a restored and renewed Peter. He's looking forward to the work that he will continue to do, not back to his shortcomings. See, and this is what Jesus tells Peter. He tells him to feed my sheep, to shepherd my people. But first and foremost, these last 2 words in this section, he just says, follow me. And this is where restoration starts for you and for me. It starts in the place where we feel broken, like there's no coming back from this. Taking that step just to follow Jesus. See, Jesus doesn't wait for Peter to start leading again. He doesn't wait for him to prove himself. He doesn't wait for him to do all these things first. He doesn't wait for him to become a better disciple. He meets him right where he is and restores him from there. And that's where Jesus will meet you and me. Right in the midst of our failure, right in the midst of our brokenness, right in the midst of the time where we feel like there is just no coming back from this. That's where Jesus shows up the best. And he says, what I need you to do is not to fix everything. What I need you to do is just to follow me. See, we get this message from Jesus that is so hard to remember sometimes, but I think it's so important. And that's that it's not, Jesus isn't telling us, restore yourself and then come to me. He's saying, come to me and I will restore you. It's not about that if I need to get myself right with Jesus, well, I need to make sure I'm in church every single week. I need to make sure I'm reading my Bible every morning. I need to make sure I've checked off every single. Once I've done this, this, and this, then he will take me back, and then he will accept me. Jesus says, no. Those are all great things. But what it starts with is just being with me. And I will do the work of restoration. See, if you are breathing, there is still time to come back to Jesus. If you are within earshot, if you are in this room, if you are breathing, there is still time to come back to Jesus. It's not too late. It's still time to experience the healing and restorative love that he offers so freely. See, God is bigger than our failure. He's bigger than our shortcomings. And if you've ever struggled or if you are struggling with yourself or with God, I think that one of the most important things you can hear comes from Psalm 103. And it says this, starting in verse 10. It says, he does not treat us as our sins deserve, or repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. And as far as the east is from the west, so far he has removed our transgressions from us. See, hear what this is saying. If you are in Jesus, it says God does not treat us as our sins deserve. And you could stop it right there. And that is the whole message of the gospel wrapped up in a few words. And that's the whole part of the gospel that's so hard for me and so hard for probably most of you to wrap our heads around. We want to treat everyone like they deserve. But we don't want to be treated like we deserve. But the good news is that we worship a God who does not treat us like we deserve. He does not treat us as our sins deserve or repay us for our iniquities, but as high as the heavens are above the earth. So great is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west. It means as far as physically, humanly possible, farther than we could ever even imagine, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. See, no action defines who you are if you are in Jesus. You are not your sin. You are not whatever label is put on you. You are not anything but a child, a son, a daughter of the King. You are not what you once were. And if you take that step given to Peter from Jesus, and just follow him. Turn away from the way you were and follow him. The fact that Jesus gives us a new identity doesn't give us permission to keep, but it gives us freedom to get out of the way that we were living. It gives us another place to go. That you don't have to continue the way you were. And it doesn't matter how many years you've been continuing that way. But we worship a God that says, if you are here, if you are breathing, there's still time. Just turn around and come back to me.